when we observe what drives the economy in the world, then of course companies explain everything, but we have different sizes of the companies, and as probably people have noticed, the majority of the companies are always called the SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, when I say the majority, is because they are almost more than 95% of the companies in the world. But the interesting part is that out of this segment of companies, micro and small firms, and I'm referring companies that have less than 50 and less than 10 employees, these companies actually represent for developing countries 99% of all the companies. Right? So now, why the regions are not growing the same, what actually explains why one economy is doing better than the other, but a lot has to do with this. A lot has to do with how micro and small firms are actually managing the economic shocks, the crises, and in general just operating in the economy. Now, when we look at this more closely, it turns out that there are huge gaps, right? You observe, for instance, companies, and I will say the example of Germany, which is, usually benchmark for how they operate micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. When we take as a baseline the productivity measured as GDP per employee per product, but you can say, let's say this in this case, GDP per employee. So you take the large enterprises. So this is the 100%. When we observe what is the productivity of a medium-sized enterprise with respect to the large one. So while the large is 100%, then the medium is usually 80%. Now, 80% is not bad at all, right? Considering that the large still has better economies of scale. Now you observe the small firms. The small firm is 70%. A company that has less than 50 employees compares with a company that has thousands of employees, 80% the productivity of the large firm. And then the micro firm, which is less than 10 employees, it turns out that this one has 68%, almost 70%. So this is interesting. These are numbers reported by the OECD. Now, 60-70% of the micro firm. When we look at, let me just take the example of Peru. Peru and Latin America. In Peru, if you compare the large firm, which is 100%, and then you say, what is the medium size? The medium size has approximately 50%. You say, okay, so now there is a huge gap. But you say 50%, okay. But then you observe what is the small and the micro. It turns out that the micro is not even 10% of the productivity of the large firm. Now, if you take 10% and the small is 15%, so it turns out that if those are 99% of the companies in Peru, that drives the economy, right? And so you may have large companies in regions like Latin America, as I'm saying, that actually, are doing great, growing even better than companies in the developed world. That's awesome. But the other side, the other tail, in this novel, it turns out that micro and small firms are the ones that are disappearing. Sometimes 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 disappears per month. Others appear because the barrier of entry is very low. And these changes actually just really creates a mess with all the economy. And of course, with the businesses, because it turns out that if we look at the supply chain, the global supply chains, all of them are full of micro and small firms. So for instance, if I mention the example of a typical problem in last mile of larger CPGs. Now, if you look at any company and I'm gonna talk about Latin America, but this is also equivalent to regions like India, like China, other regions. But I will say in Latin America, companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, many CPG companies, they actually deliver their products to something that we call, the nano stores. It's a term not developed also here at the CTL. They like it, but it refers to the mom and pop stores. So very small, retailers. These smaller retailers represent for these businesses, depending on the country in Latin America, from 40% to 70% of all the sales. This is huge, right? They are actually bigger than delivering to a Walmart or other large retailer in Latin America. Now, when we look at this even closely, it turns out that these micro firms, the nano stores, some of them in many regions disappear 10% per month. But there are 11% that appear per month. So now actually the market is growing, but it's not the same. So every time now imagine that every month you have new companies appearing and those that are disappearing. So every month you are actually having a different operation. So you need to send someone from sales trying to look for the new ones, updating this portfolio, and then again delivering. And every change may cause that you don't know again where to park. You probably need to create a relationship again with the nano store. You need to deliver probably and recollect the cash multiple times. So there are so many different challenges that actually affect the large firms' logistics operation as well. So in a way, what we argue in this study is paying attention to the micro and small firms, actually helps not just the economy, not just the micro and small firms, but also larger players that also can gain because of the efficiency and survival of these micro firms. And this is what the Genesis project is all about, helping micro and small firms in developing countries improve productivity and survival rates via focusing on better practices, business practices, and supply chain management practices.